At my family's most important party, I was told, "You have no right to express an opinion." Have you ever heard anything like it? Ever felt that bitter mixture of humiliation and disbelief, as if your entire history had been erased in a single sentence? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't someone unfamiliar with my life, it was the people I loved most, the ones who received the most from me and, ironically, the ones for whom I sacrificed everything. I stood there, looking at that table of smiling guests. The hall decorated with every detail I'd once dreamed of helping to create. Every flower, every dish served, every song played, everything bore my mark, even if they pretended not to see it. And yet, in that moment, I was nothing more than a burden, a living ornament, someone to occupy a chair in the corner. Have you ever been there, feeling that, after years of carrying the weight of others, when the moment finally arrives to celebrate, your voice is ripped away as if it had never existed? I felt my face burn, not with shame because, deep down, I knew what I had done, but with an indignation so deep that the smile I had forced turned into a silent clench of my jaw. I remember every second as if it were now. The waiter passed by with the trays, the laughter echoed, and the music seemed distant. All I heard was the sound of that phrase repeating in my mind, "You have no right to have an opinion." I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but it's as if someone took years of your life, all your sacrifices, and threw them in the trash. The cruelest thing was that no one there seemed to notice. No one knew that, months earlier, I'd sold my house. No one knew about the sleepless nights sewing to pay the catering bills, or the clothes I'd skipped so I could help with the bride's dress. All of this because I wanted to see their smiles, because I believed that family was about being present, helping, giving what you can and sometimes what you can't. And yet, there I was, hands in my lap, staring at a plate of food I had helped pay for myself, being treated like an extra in a story I had written. Stay with me until the end, because you'll understand how I realized, in time, that this wasn't just a phrase spoken in the heat of the moment. It was a reflection of something much deeper, the silent ingratitude that grows in the hearts of those who grow accustomed to receiving without gratitude. As they toasted, exchanging knowing glances, I felt a movie play in my head. Every time I'd put aside my own pain to listen to theirs, every time I'd put aside a dream because they had a more pressing problem, every time I'd stood up for them, even when I knew they were wrong. Did they even remember? Did they ever think about all the hardships it took for me to be there? Have you ever felt that mixture of loneliness and presence, of being surrounded by people and, at the same time, being invisible? Well, there, in the middle of that illuminated party, I felt more alone than I had on any other night. And the worst part, the realization that if I didn't do anything, it wouldn't change. They would continue to laugh, continue to benefit from my silence, continue to believe I had no voice. I glanced at the corner of the room and saw an old photo, a photo they'd placed as decoration, of a happy moment. In it, I was holding my still small son, with that look of someone who believes all the effort will be worth it. That portrait hit me like a punch. There was living proof of who I had been for them. And, even though I was being ignored at that moment, there was something inside me that still pulsed. It was then that a decision began to dawn. It wasn't a loud outburst. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was a silent shift, like opening a door no one noticed. While the rest of the family was distracted by toasts and jokes, I began mentally assembling each piece of what would come next. No, I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't ruin the party. But I knew there was a way to make everyone there remember forever who truly built that day. You'll understand how I realized in time to turn that humiliation into something they would never forget. Because sometimes, the best answer isn't given right away, it's prepared.com, and delivered at the right moment. While I smiled, pretending to follow the conversation of those at my table, inside I was already far away. Far from there, but close to what I needed to do. And as the night wore on, each minute seemed to push me closer to the moment when everything would change. I didn't know how they would react. I didn't know if there would be tears, anger, or silence. But I knew that when it happened, nothing would be the same. And so it was, amidst lights, music, and laughter that didn't belong to me, that I began to plan the exact moment when everyone there would have to look me in the eye and see the truth they had so ignored. But you'll find out soon enough. Because what happened at the toast changed everything. My name is Dorothy May. I'm 76 years old, and I carry on my hands the marks of a lifetime of work and sacrifice. I was both mother and father, a seamstress by day, a cook at dawn, a counselor in times of crisis, and a shield against the storms that threatened our small home. I raised my son alone, expecting nothing in return other than to see him grow up healthy, dignified, and happy. I sold my car, I sold my house, and each time I gave up a part of myself, I told myself I was investing in his future. I always believed that a mother's love had the power to protect, to shape character, to plant deep roots of gratitude. I believed that one day he would look back and understand that nothing was easy, but that everything was done for him. I remember when he was just a boy, running down the street with scraped knees and the most beautiful smile I'd ever seen. I would pick him up, even exhausted, and think, it's worth it. And for many years, I truly believed that life before that day was simple. And despite the hardships, it also had its bright moments. We weren't rich, but there was warmth in our home. I was proud to see my son graduate, get a good job, buy his first car. Each of his achievements was like a piece of my own dream coming true. It was as if every sleepless night, every meal I skipped, every outfit I sewed myself to save money had all been worth it. When he told me he was getting married, my eyes filled with tears, not because I was worried about the changes or the distance that might come, but because I imagined it would be one of the happiest days of my life. I saw myself sitting in the front row, watching every detail with pride, feeling that, somehow, I, too, was there at the altar, because without what I did, none of it would have been possible. One, involved myself in the preparations as best I could. Even when they didn't ask for my help, I found a way to contribute. I paid late installments, made advance payments for the catering, bought extra flowers because I wanted the decorations to be perfect. It wasn't about money, it was about meaning. It was about showing that, even at 76, I was still an active part of the family, still needed. But behind the scenes, there were signs I didn't want to see. Scattered comments about letting the young people decide, glances exchanged when I suggested something, and that condescending tone one uses with someone who supposedly no longer understands things. I ignored them, believing they were just misunderstandings. Maybe I was just being too sensitive. After all, who wants to believe they're being left aside by those they love most? On the day of the party, I was ready early. I chose a simple but elegant blue dress and tied my hair up like I did on Sundays at church. As I served the cake to some guests, I felt my face smile, but the look gave away something I didn't want to admit, because, deep down, there was already a growing unease, a silent awareness that something wasn't right. The voices around me seemed more distant than ever. I saw my son surrounded by friends and family, laughing, hugging, but rarely meeting my eyes. It was as if I were just another presence in the room, someone to fill space in the photos. And I, who had given my entire life for that day to exist, felt as if I were watching someone else's story. The transformation of that moment didn't happen suddenly, but that day everything began to take shape. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing the hidden truth I hadn't wanted to see. To them, I was no longer the foundation, the reference, or even an important part of the narrative. I was, at best, an ornament. This realization came as a silent but profound impact. I began to remember every time I'd been ignored in the past few months, every decision made without even mentioning my name. The small wounds, accumulated, now, seemed to form a massive scar. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could no longer pretend nothing was happening. My journey thus far had been paved with difficult decisions and calculated sacrifices. I knew what it meant to let go. I knew what it meant to swallow my pride. I knew what it meant to stand firm even when no one recognized the effort. But there, amid the music and laughter, I realized that this chapter of my life was about to change direction. There was no going back to my previous naivete, no unseeing what was before me. The question now was no longer if I would do something, but when and how, because, after a lifetime of silence, I felt I was about to regain my voice, and, when that happened, nothing would ever be the same. As I walked slowly through the room, greeting a few acquaintances, I was already reliving the behind-the-scenes moments of everything I'd done, every bill paid, every sleepless night, every moment I'd defended my son against all reason. It was all there, pulsing like a force I'd previously kept hidden. And it was exactly at that moment, when my hand touched the microphone resting on the soundboard, that something inside me decided that the silence was about to end. I remember exactly the day I first heard those words. It wasn't in the heat of an argument, nor in a moment of extreme tension. It was an ordinary morning, in the kitchen, as we discussed the final details of the wedding menu. I suggested something simple, a family keepsake that had always been part of our celebrations. I thought that, because it had meaning and everyone liked it, it would be greeted with a smile. But it wasn't. Linda, my daughter Lenla, looked up from her phone for a second and, in a cold, cutting tone, said, "You have no right to have an opinion. This is our business." The sentence entered me like a thin, icy blade. There was no shout, no aggressive gesture, just that combination of words, spoken so casually, as if I were an intruder in my own home. I felt my eyes sting, but I swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't come close to being genuine. I said I understood, that it was okay, and continued stirring the spoon in the pan, even though the taste of the food no longer mattered. What struck me wasn't just the content of the sentence, but what it carried between the lines. It wasn't just about a plate of food. It was about place, about value, about belonging. And in that moment, I realized something was changing, or maybe it had been changing for a long time, and I just hadn't noticed. From that day on, I began to pay closer attention. I noticed how my opinions were heard with polite silence, but rarely taken into account, how certain decisions were made without my even being informed. And by the time I found out, everything was already decided, packaged, and ready. Each time this happened, a small rift opened between us, and I, out of pride or fear, convinced myself it was best not to create friction, but the signs mounted. In conversations, I noticed my name appearing less frequently. In plans, my presence seemed more of a formality than a genuine desire. I was invited to be there, but not to participate, and, as much as I tried to ignore it, each gesture reminded me that the space that had once been mine was now shrinking. The strangest thing is that, to the outsider, everything seemed perfect. The photos showed a smiling family, Sunday lunches seemed peaceful, and the occasional messages in the family group gave the impression that we were close. But behind the scenes, there was a growing, silent, and uncomfortable distance. A distance that wasn't measured in meters, but in decisions made without me, in secrets shared only between them. And it wasn't just the wedding. Even in small things, like choosing a gift for someone close or how to organize a family gathering, my opinion wasn't sought. It wasn't that I stopped wanting to help, it was that they had decided my help wasn't needed. And this kind of exclusion doesn't scream, it doesn't explode. It settles like a shadow, silent but constant. There was a day, a few weeks before the wedding, when I arrived early at their house to help pack favors. I remember walking into the living room and seeing Linda and my younger sister finishing up their work, laughing and chatting. There was an empty space at the table, but not for me. When I asked if she needed help, Linda replied, "Oh, everything's under control. You can rest." It sounded like a caution, but the subtext was clear. We don't need you. These small scenes formed a mosaic that gradually revealed the hidden truth. It wasn't that I had less energy or fewer ideas, it was that my place had been discreetly moved to the corner. I often wondered if this was just a result of a new family dynamic, something that naturally developed over the years. But there was something different about this change. It wasn't just the timing, it was the mindset. It was as if my presence had been reduced to a formality, and realizing this was as impactful as hearing that first sentence about the menu. After that, I began to rethink many things. Not just about the marriage, but about my own trajectory. I mentally relived moments when I gave up opportunities, parties, and trips to prioritize family. Moments when I agreed to work twice as hard so my son could have what I never had. Each memory was accompanied by a nagging question: does he remember? During that time, my house felt quieter than ever, not because of the noise itself, but because of the absence of conversations that truly mattered. It was as if I had become a spectator in my own life, watching decisions pass before me without my having any influence on them. And so, every time someone said, "This is our thing," or "We've already decided," it wasn't just a phrase, it was a reminder that, in their eyes, my role had changed. And though I still smiled, still helped, still showed up for photos, something inside began to stir. Because a lifetime of sacrifice can't simply be brushed aside as if it were disposable. And, even if they didn't realize it, I knew something was about to change. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I knew that series of small cuts was making room for something bigger, something that wouldn't come with shouting or arguing, but with the clarity and strength of someone who finally understands their own worth. And as the wedding date approached, I felt that the day when this transformation would happen was getting closer and closer. A few days before the party, something unexpected happened that struck a chord with me. I was at home, tending my plants on the porch, when I heard a light knock on the door. When I opened it, there was Brian, my son, holding a bouquet of flowers. They were white lilies, the same ones I used to buy him for his birthday when he was little because he said the scent reminded him of happy days. He smiled, that smile I've known since he had baby teeth, and said he wanted to spend time with me before the big day. I felt a warmth rise in my chest, as if suddenly all those strange signs from the past few weeks were just misinterpretations on my part. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe it was just the rush of the wedding, and now he wanted to show me that I still mattered. We sat at the kitchen table, and he held my hand. "Mom, you mean so much to me. None of this would be happening without you." The words came as a relief. It was as if the weight accumulated in my chest began to dissolve. I wanted to believe. There, in that moment, I believed. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about the future, about family, about how he wanted me to always be around. And, hearing all this, I felt a twinge of hope. Maybe the distance I'd been feeling was just a temporary effect, and things were falling into place. As he spoke, I remembered other moments, other conversations we'd had in the past. I remembered when, as a teenager, he promised he'd never leave me alone. I remembered when, after moving to another city to study, he'd call me every day to tell me how class had gone. These flashes came like little gifts wrapped in my memory, making me feel that, yes, I still had my son with me. The lilies sat in the center of the table for days. It was impossible not to notice the transformation that visit wrought in me. I started smiling more, grooming myself more carefully. Even the way I spoke to him changed. It felt like a knot had been untied. I found myself dreaming about the party. I imagined the moment he would come up to me, among the guests, and thank me publicly. I imagined the pride in his eyes, and even the surprise of the others when they realized that, despite everything, mother and son remained united. In my mind, that day would be confirmation that all my effort had been worth it. But there was something, subtle, almost imperceptible, that I missed. Maybe it was a look he exchanged with Linda as we discussed the final preparations. Maybe it was the hurried way he said goodbye, as if his mind was already elsewhere. In that moment, I chose not to care. I chose to cling to his words, to the flowers, to the feeling that things were falling into place. That choice, I now know, was an emotional one, not a rational one. It was more comfortable to believe the comforting image he had painted for me than to face the possibility that something was wrong behind the scenes. It's curious how our mind, when it wants to protect our heart, creates its own narrative where everything seems safe. Those days before the party felt like a brief spring to me. The atmosphere between us felt lighter. He called to see if I needed anything, asked about the dress I was wearing, and even mentioned that he wanted me to arrive early so we could have some alone time. These small gestures, which might have gone unnoticed by others, were clear signs to me that we were reconnecting. I didn't know it, but I was living in a false sense of security. Everything seemed to calm. And when the calm is so perfect, it's because a storm is already on the horizon. As I was packing my shoes the night before the party, I thought about how life is made of cycles, and I felt grateful to believe I was entering a new one, a cycle in which I would once again be valued, heard, and included. It was a sweet, almost naive thought, but deeply necessary for me at that moment. Perhaps, if I'd paid closer attention, I would have realized that the bouquet of lilies wasn't just a gesture of affection, but also a way to keep my defenses down. Perhaps I would have realized that the sweet words, though sincere on the surface, hid a hidden truth I wasn't yet ready to face. However, at that point, my heart was too busy dreaming of the moment when everything would fall into place. I imagined the impact of seeing my son recognize me in front of everyone, and how it would erase every little hurt from the past few months. What I didn't know was that, while I dreamed of this moment, other decisions were being made, hidden from my knowledge, decisions that would completely change the way I viewed not only my son, but the entire dynamic of our family. And so, with the lilies still fresh on the table, and a dress carefully hanging behind the door, I fell asleep the night before the party, believing I was about to experience one of the happiest days of my life. In the week following that flower visit, something began to change more clearly, as if the thin veneer of care and attention had served only to disguise what was to come. I noticed it in the small details. Messages that had previously been sent to me were now being sent to other relatives. Important conversations about the wedding took place, but without my phone ringing. And when I asked questions, I received curt answers, as if I were invading territory that was no longer mine. The feeling was of being present, yet excluded. A physical presence, but voiceless. Even inside my own home, the air felt colder. When Brian and Linda showed up, they'd arrive with a ready-made script. "We're just dropping this off, or we're leaving. We have an appointment." There were quick conversations, hurried glances, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was during this period that I noticed a silent transformation taking place in my mindset. It wasn't just sadness. It was a mixture of bewilderment and a contained anger, the kind that doesn't explode but slowly erodes. The hidden truth I was beginning to see was that this wasn't just pre-wedding stress. It was a deliberate reconfiguration of my place in the family. I was no longer consulted, no longer part of the behind-the-scenes decision-making. And for someone who had dedicated her entire life to being at the center of this story, this was more than unfair, it was cruel. The escalation was rapid. One night, I learned from an acquaintance that the guest list had changed. People I'd expected to see there were no longer attending, and others I barely knew had been included. When I questioned him, Brian replied that he didn't want to bother me with the details, as if my presence were a matter of protocol, not a central element in that moment. In the silence of my living room, I stared at the walls covered in old photos, each one telling a part of our journey. I saw Brian's face as a child, in his school uniform. I saw the two of us on birthdays, on Christmases, on ordinary days that felt extraordinary just because we were together. And I began to wonder at what point in this timeline I had stopped being a priority. The injustice didn't just come from being excluded from decisions. It came from the way my opinion was subtly devalued, as if I'd lost the ability to contribute. One day, I offered to help adjust the flower arrangements. Linda, without even looking at me, said, "Oh, everything's under control now." Her tone wasn't one of gratitude, but of closure, as if to say, "Your role here is over." This coldness was a constant blow. In my kitchen, where we used to laugh while preparing meals, an uncomfortable silence now reigned. Visits became quick and calculated, as if each minute there were just a formality to be fulfilled. I started thinking more about the mentality behind it all. Is it that, as a mother ages, her story is automatically pushed to the footnotes of her children's lives? Could the effort, impact, and sacrifice of decades be so easily forgotten, replaced by a narrative where only the present matters? With each new act of exclusion, I felt something inside me shrink. It wasn't just the pain of being left out, but the realization that if I didn't speak out, that invisible role would become permanent. The transformation that was beginning to unfold within me was silent, but real. I no longer wanted to simply understand the reason for all this. I wanted to find a way to reclaim my dignity. There was a dinner, a few days before the party, where the coldness reached the point of making me feel like an outsider. We were sitting at the table, but the conversation was only between them. Plans for the ceremony, details about the day, and there I was, cutting my piece of meat, not included. When Brian finally looked at me and asked if I was enjoying the food, I realized that was the only question he directed at me in over an hour. After that night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how life could change so abruptly. A week earlier, I'd believed the flowers signified reconciliation. Now, I realized they were merely a strategic pause, a break before the final blow. The exclusion within my own home was the hardest part to swallow, because home had always been my safe territory, the space where I had control, where every corner held my decisions and memories. Seeing that space become a stage of coldness and distance was like watching a strange play unfold on my own stage, but without the right to speak. And as the party approached, I began to understand that what was to come wouldn't just be an unpleasant moment or a misunderstanding. No, this was of greater proportions, and the impact would be profound. It felt like walking toward something inevitable, like someone watching the tides slowly rise, knowing they'll soon be completely surrounded by water. What I didn't know was that, on that specific night of the party, all the signs of isolation and all the accumulated injustices would take shape before everyone, without masks, without subtleties, revealing at once the true extent of what had been hidden. There came a point where it no longer took effort to understand what was happening. The isolation that had previously come in small doses now became almost explicit, as if Linda had decided to take complete control of every detail, leaving me out without the slightest embarrassment. There were no more attempts at disguise, just a calculated sequence of exclusions that, observed from afar, seemed like simple practical decisions, but up close, carried a much deeper weight. I no longer participated in any wedding conversations. The gatherings where I'd once volunteered to help were replaced by silent meetings I only learned about later. When, at some point, I dared to ask about something, be it the type of music, the order of the ceremony, or even a detail about the menu, I received curt, almost automatic responses. "We've already decided," or worse, "Don't worry about it." Linda's tone was sweet, but it carried a subtext impossible to ignore. "Don't interfere." It was a veiled threat, disguised in polite words. She didn't need to raise her voice to silence me. That quick, firm look was enough, saying without saying it, "Your time is up." As the days went by, I began to realize how these small interactions shaped my own attitude. I began to speak less, to express fewer opinions, not because I had nothing to say, but because I felt that any word I spoke would be dismissed before it was even heard. And this, for me, was more painful than any direct confrontation, because confrontation, at least, acknowledges the other person's existence. Forced silence, on the other hand, is like erasure. In my house, the air felt as if it had changed. When they showed up, it was always in a rush, as if their time with me were a break between more important tasks. Conversations took place between them, about topics that seemed to have no place for me. And I, sitting at the table, increasingly, felt like an extra. One afternoon, Linda came in alone to retrieve a document Brian had forgotten. She entered, quickly glanced around the room, and commented, "Wow, everything looks the same here. You should change it up a bit, make it more modern." It was said with a smile, but the tone carried a veiled criticism, as if my space and, by extension, myself were outdated. I responded with a maybe someday, but deep down, it hit me like confirmation of something I'd already feared. It wasn't just my opinion that was being pushed aside. It was my identity that was being pushed out of the family narrative. As I organized everything, I realized this wasn't just a party plan. It was a process of rebuilding myself. Each document I kept was also a reaffirmation of who I was and what I had accomplished. The transformation. This phase was marked by a constant sense of emotional vigilance. I found myself measuring my words, calculating my gestures, avoiding anything that could be interpreted as interference. It wasn't a fear of confrontation. I had already faced much bigger things in life. It was the awareness that, in that dynamic, I was seen as someone who needed to be controlled, kept on the sidelines, almost as if I were a piece in a game whose board I could no longer access. The transformation this wrought within me was silent but immense. I began to observe more than I spoke. I began to notice the behind-the-scenes nature of every decision, the exchanged glances, the quick whispers between Linda and Brian, the calculated pauses when I entered the room. It was like watching a play whose script I no longer helped write, but I still knew enough to predict the next scenes. And with each new act of exclusion, it became clearer to me that this wasn't an oversight or a coincidence. It was a choice, a conscious decision to remove myself from areas of influence and confine myself to the role of a silent spectator. And perhaps what hurt most wasn't the action itself, but the fact that it came from people I would have done anything for. There was a dinner where Brian, sitting next to Linda, was talking about last-minute changes to the ceremony. I was there, listening, but he never addressed me. It was only when he finished explaining to one of his uncles that he turned, smiled, and said, "Oh, but you don't have to worry, Mom. Just relax and enjoy." This phrase, said affectionately, actually carried a very clear message. Your role here is to watch, not participate. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that, as much as I wanted to believe this would pass, that things would go back to the way they were before, the hidden truth was already staring me in the face. They had rewritten my place in history, and I had only two choices: accept it or find a way to turn things around. This realization wasn't accompanied by explosive anger. It was more like a silent awakening, a clarity that sets in and suddenly changes the way you see every detail. I was no longer just living in the moment. I was analyzing it, memorizing every gesture, every word, like someone putting together a puzzle to understand the final design. And as the wedding date approached, I realized that the distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was strategic. And if there was one thing I'd learned in life, it's that every strategy has a point of vulnerability, and sooner or later, I would find theirs. That night, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. The absence of voices, the distant sound of the street, even the ticking of the clock seemed to remind me that I was alone. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding in my lap a wooden box that held memories from a lifetime ago. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, carefully folded letters, hastily scribbled notes, and, at the bottom, a photo that always made me feel whole, my husband and I, many years ago, smiling as if we believed nothing could bring us down. I picked up that photo and studied every detail, the soft lines of his face, the way his arm wrapped tightly around me, as if to say without words that I was a non-negotiable part of his life. And it was looking at that smile that I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was a decision, a shift in mindset, an inner voice telling me I could no longer pretend everything was okay. I leaned my forehead against the frame and whispered, "No more swallowing in silence. They'll remember who I am." It was one of those moments when the phrase seems to come from a place so deep you don't even know exactly how you found the courage to say it. But once said, it settles in and begins to guide your thoughts, your decisions, your next step. I stood up slowly, as if no longer carrying only the weight of pain, but also the fuel to transform it into something greater. I walked to the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a while. Pastor Samuel. That man had seen more of my life than many people with my last name. He knew who I was, what I'd faced, and the importance of a word spoken at the right time. When he answered, his voice carried that calm that reminded me of Sunday mornings at church, before life became so rough. I explained what was happening, not with lamentations, but with the clarity of someone who had already drawn a line in the sand. "I need your help preparing something special for the party," I said. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he understood exactly what I meant without needing to explain much. "I'm with you," he replied. From that moment on, I began to see the remaining days until the wedding differently. They were no longer just a countdown to an event where I would be invisible. They were preparation for an act that would carry impact, revelation, and, most of all, a reclaiming of my own voice. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want empty confrontations. I wanted to create a moment in which every person in that room would be forced to see me, not as the old lady in the corner, but as the woman who had held the foundation of it all with her own hands. I spent the following nights revisiting memories and documents, receipts, photos, letters, every piece of my story that proved, indisputably, how much I had contributed to that day's existence. It wasn't just about money, it was about sacrifice, about choices made in silence, about an entire journey dedicated to building something that now seemed to be the sole responsibility of others. As I sorted through everything, I realized how much that search was also transforming me internally. It was as if, by revisiting each moment of struggle and achievement, I was reconnecting with the strongest version of myself, the one who had faced losses, new beginnings, nights of uncertainty, and still remained standing. Pastor Samuel helped me think about the best way to present it without it seeming like a direct attack. But at the same time, it would be impossible to ignore. We wanted a moment that would be marked not only by emotion, but by the raw truth that carried a truth that had been hidden, neglected, and often conveniently forgotten. As we refined the details, I realized the idea went far beyond showing who paid for the party or who did what. It was about restoring a narrative that was being rewritten without my participation. It was about correcting the perceptions of everyone who was ready to believe the most comfortable version of the story, the one where I was just a guest, taking up space. With each call, each adjustment to the plan, I felt my confidence grow. It wasn't arrogance. It was the certainty that I was doing something that needed to be done, that I was shining a light where there was shadow, and perhaps also showing everyone that, behind a silent person, there may be a strength no one imagines until it's revealed. Deep down, I knew this moment would come at a price. I knew not everyone would react well, that some bridges might be burned, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. Because worse than facing the consequences of taking a stand would be living the rest of my days wondering what would have happened if I had done something. Then, amidst open boxes, on the floor and papers strewn across the bed, I found myself smiling to myself, not the sad, resigned smile of the past few months, but the smile of someone rediscovering their own reflection after years of staring at someone else in the mirror. A smile that silently said, "I'm ready." And as the date approached, that feeling of helplessness that had haunted me for so long began to give way to something new, a mix of calm and determination. I knew the party would have lights, music, and lots of smiling faces, but in the midst of it all, there would also be a moment when the room would fall silent, and in that moment, everyone there, without exception, would hear me. I spent the next morning with the calm of someone who already knows exactly what needs to be done. There was no rush, but there was no hesitation either. My every move had a purpose. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years, rummaged through boxes high in the closet, dusted off folders that held concrete pieces of my story. There, among the aged papers, were the pay stubs that, too many, would seem like simple receipts, but to me, they were living proof of sleepless nights, of overtime that was never paid, of difficult decisions made in silence to make my son's day perfect. Every invoice, every contract signature, every transfer, and all of it was part of a mosaic that told, more honestly than any words, the hidden truth that was being erased. I held one of those sheets for a few seconds, remembering the exact day I signed it. I remember the tightness in my chest, knowing that, with that payment, I would be 2 weeks behind on my electricity bill. But I also remember thinking it would be worth it, because family was a priority. Alongside the receipts, I began sorting through old photos. Not just those that showed happy moments, but also those that captured behind-the-scenes moments. Images of me working late, preparing orders, selling pieces I sewed myself to supplement my rent. Photos where the smile was there, but the eyes betrayed the weariness. These images weren't meant to evoke pity, they were meant to reveal what had always been invisible to those who only see the end result, never the process. The action wasn't just about preparing something to show others, but about the mindset shift it sparked. I was no longer seeing myself as a victim. I was taking on the role of protagonist of my own narrative. Pastor Samuel, always with that calm demeanor, helped me think through the details. We discussed how to lay it all out without sounding like an attack, but in a way that would be impossible to ignore. He reminded me that the truth, when presented clearly and without anger, has a much greater impact. And that's what I wanted. Impact. Not just for Brian and Linda, but for every person in that room who, consciously or unconsciously, had grown accustomed to seeing me as someone who no longer mattered. There was a moment, while organizing the photos, when I stopped and stared at one in particular. It was from a rainy day, as I carried a heavy package to the bus, carrying a broken umbrella. At the time, I was carrying supplies for an extra job that would help me pay for part of the catering. No one knew this detail. No one ever asked. And in that moment, I realized that the strength that kept me going on days like that was the same one that was now pushing me forward. The curious thing is that the more I reviewed these tests, the less nervous I felt. There was no room for insecurity. It was as if I was finally understanding that I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just had to present the truth, naked and raw, and let it do the work for me. I began to imagine the exact moment I would use it all. It wouldn't be dramatic or inappropriate. I would wait for the moment when everyone was together, relaxed, believing that the evening would follow a predictable script, and then, like someone turning the last page of a book and finding an unexpected revelation, I would reveal what I had in store. This plan gave me new energy. It made me walk differently, talk differently, even breathe differently. It was no longer just Dorothy waiting to be recognized. It was Dorothy creating the moment when it would happen. And perhaps most importantly, it was Dorothy who, regardless of others' reactions, had already regained the certainty of her own worth. Over the next few days, I kept the folders ready, the envelopes labeled, the photos sorted. Everything was carefully stored, but within easy reach. And each time I went through the material, I felt I wasn't just gathering evidence of sacrifice, I was piecing together my identity, reconstructing something that had been fragmented over the years. The day before the party, I looked at the table where all the materials were laid out and felt a sense of peace. Not because I knew exactly how everything would unfold, but because I finally felt in control of my own story, no matter how much they tried to push me into the corner. I had already found a way back to the center, and this time, no one was going to pull me away. The room was lit up, filled with mingled voices and laughter, echoing between the flower-decorated walls and soft lights. The sweet scent of the newly arrived cake filled the air, and everyone crowded together, eager for the evening's most symbolic moment. I sat a few feet away, observing every detail like someone watching a play they've rehearsed countless times in their mind. Every gesture, every look, every laugh that ignored my presence seemed only to reinforce the importance of what I was about to do. The microphone rested on a small table next to the stage. I knew that within minutes it would be in my hands. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. I stood up slowly, feeling both heavy and light at the same time. Heavy because of the significance of the moment, light because of the knowledge that, after so long swallowing in silence, I would finally have my voice back. Brian, with a smile that mixed nervousness and euphoria, held the knife next to Linda, ready to cut the cake. Guests raised their phones to record the scene, and soft music played in the background. It was at that moment that I stepped forward. "Before you cut the cake," my voice came out firmly, more than I expected. The sound echoed through the room, causing all conversation to suddenly stop. I saw eyes turn to me, some curious, others confused. "I want to show who really paid for all this." There was a brief silence, followed by a subdued murmur. Linda frowned, clearly uncomfortable, while Brian looked at me as if trying to guess what would come next. I made a small gesture to the person in charge of the screen, and the first image appeared. It was an old photo of me sitting at my sewing machine, my hands working in the dim light of dawn. Images followed of me delivering packages, carrying heavy bags in the rain, signing sales papers for my own home. Each photo was accompanied by dates and amounts, concrete proof of every sacrifice I had made for that day to exist. The hall fell into absolute silence. The sound of the music faded, replaced by a dense, almost palpable atmosphere. Some guests exchanged glances, others shook their heads in disapproval of what they saw. In the corner, I saw Pastor Samuel approach, his serene expression contrasting with the general discomfort. He took the microphone from me for a moment and said, his voice slow but full of meaning, "Those who sow gratitude reap love. Those who sow contempt reap loneliness." The words hung in the air like a sentence. It wasn't a direct attack, but it also left no room for soft interpretation. It was the truth, simply stated, but with enough weight to pierce any defense. I looked back at Brian and Linda. They stood motionless, embarrassment etched on every feature of their faces. Brian averted his eyes, while Linda forced a tight smile at the nearest guests, as if trying to control the narrative right then and there, but it was too late. I could see on the faces around me that the truth had spread like wildfire. Whispers began to emerge, discreet at first, then bolder. I saw one of the uncles lean toward his wife and shake his head indignantly. An old family friend looked at me and nodded discreetly, as if recognizing not only the courage but also the justice of the moment. There was no shouting, no arguing, just the silent weight of a revelation that could no longer be erased. The impact was felt, no matter how many excuses were made later, how many versions they tried to tell everyone there had seen the truth with their own eyes. I took a deep breath. It wasn't a sense of noisy victory, but a quiet catharsis. I didn't need anyone to applaud me. Simply breaking the silence, showing what really happened, was enough. And as their eyes remained fixed on me and the screen still, showing fragments of my journey, I realized the game had changed, not just for me, but for everyone in that room. The narrative had been rewritten before everyone's eyes, and this time, I was the author. The moment seemed to stretch on in time, as if everyone was waiting for the next step, and deep down, I knew the night still held more revelations. The party ended with a strange atmosphere, as if the air had changed density. The laughter returned, but it was quieter, more restrained. Conversations flowed, but with an unprecedented care in their choice of words. Some approached me to hug me, others avoided eye contact, as if processing what they had just witnessed. I, for my part, wasn't seeking any immediate recognition. It wasn't applause I wanted. It was the truth, and the truth had already been exposed. There was no turning back. When I left the salon, the night was cold, but not uncomfortably so. It was a clean, almost welcoming chill that enveloped me like a light blanket. I walked slowly to my car, feeling each step as part of a closing ritual, not of a bond, but of a phase, a long phase marked by silence and renunciation that was finally coming to an end. On the way home, the city looked different. The streetlights reflected on the wet asphalt, and I had this strange feeling that, somehow, even the scenery knew something had changed inside me. I remembered the late nights at work, the bills I'd had to choose to pay, the dreams I'd put on hold so others could take theirs. I also remembered the times I'd almost given up on myself, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel bitter. I felt pride. Arriving home, I hung up my coat, placed my bag on the chair, and allowed myself a moment of absolute silence, the kind of silence that doesn't suffocate, but liberates. I went to the living room, sat in the armchair, and stared at the wall where I'd hung some of the photos I'd selected for the presentation. They were more than just images. They were reminders that, regardless of who recognizes them or not, I know exactly the value of my story. I went to the bedroom and saw, on the dresser, the same photo of me and my husband who had been with me throughout this process. I gently touched the frame and, without realizing it, I was smiling. It wasn't a smile of euphoria, but of peace. Peace for having done what needed to be done. Peace for knowing my voice is no longer buried under the weight of other people's convenience. Peace for having shown that dignity is not negotiable. They'll never look at me the same way again, and I won't look at them the same way either. Some wounds heal, but they leave scars. And, contrary to what many think, some scars don't need to be erased. They exist to remind us of who we are and what we've been able to face. I lay down on the bed, and as darkness filled the room, I felt a different weight on my body. It wasn't exhaustion. It was relief. The feeling of finally closing a cycle that, for years, had seemed endless. The same Dorothy who entered that party, invisible and contained, wasn't the same one who left, and this transformation, silent but profound, was now a part of me. Pastor Samuel's words still echoed in my mind. Those who sow gratitude reap love. Those who sow contempt reap loneliness. It wasn't just a message for Brian or Linda. It was a reminder for anyone who's ever forgotten to look back and acknowledge the hands that helped hold their dreams. I knew life would go on. Perhaps there would still be uncomfortable encounters. Perhaps some people would prefer to keep their distance. But none of that would change the essential. The truth had been told, and once it finds the light, there's no going back to the shadows. Before falling asleep, I allowed myself one last thought. No matter how long it takes, it's always worth reclaiming your own worth. Not because others need to recognize it, but because we need to remember it. And, that night, I slept peacefully. For the first time in many years, without emotional entanglements, without words stuck in my throat, without that invisible weight that had been with me for so long. In the silence of the early morning, as the world outside continued its rhythm, I knew I had done more than expose an injustice. I had reclaimed the narrative of my own story. And from that moment on, no one would have the power to take it from me. If you've stuck with me this far, I think this story already says a lot about what we've built together here. If it resonated with you, if this message somehow resonated with you, leave a comment. This message was for me. I'd love to know who made it to the end. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories that, like this one, carry lessons and truths we often forget to share. And if this video touched you, leave a like, not out of habit, but because it shows me that it's worth continuing to share moments like this. And look, there's a video right here that complements this topic and brings another perspective that can really change the way you see certain relationships. Click and stay with me there.